Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Where is the truth about COVID? Do you ever feel like you're getting lied to by the mainstream media? Do you ever feel like you're getting lied to by some of the professionals in the medical community? And what about the so-called vaccine? It's not really a vaccine, is it? Is it experimental? How many have died or been injured as a result of taking this vaccine? Certainly it happens with every vaccine, but has there been an inordinate amount of people who have been suffering under this procedure? In my circle of friends, a relatively healthy and young man suffered a heart attack and blood clots not long after receiving the vaccine. It was only by a miracle that his wife was there with some aspirin and saved his life by giving him aspirin. His life now is changed going forward. His work future is uncertain, and we don't know about his health. Another friend reported to me suffering lingering and unexplained arm and hand pain and weakness following vaccination. There is no other explanation as to why this suddenly occurred just a few days after receiving a vaccine. And what do you do if your employer mandates an experimental medical procedure and you don't wish to take it, but it becomes a condition of your employment? I know some employers, even the city of Charlottesville, which has previously stated you must take a vaccine, and if you do not, you must wear a mask. What about pregnant women? Has there been an inordinate loss of early-term pregnancies, as was reported recently? If you look at the media, you'll find interviews that have been blocked or removed, qualified medical professionals who are raising questions that the media doesn't want talked about. Why is that? Because they're complicit in this 24/7 Orwellian messaging to get vaccines. Have you heard these over and over and over again on the radio and the television station? Even in the car radios, while the songs are playing, where they usually show the name of the artist, they're showing messaging encouraging you to get vaccinated. And what about the alternatives to vaccination? Hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, zinc, and antibiotics, vitamin D, others that have been proven helpful in studies across the world and even here in the United States. And yet this information is being squelched. Why? Is there so much money invested in these vaccines that they don't want people to know there is an inexpensive way to avoid getting them? And then, of course, there are masks. I filed a lawsuit over a year ago against Governor Northam and his unlawful mask mandate. And now we have studies coming out showing that masks, well, when they're tested, are full of bacteria and viruses, dangerous, toxic medical waste, and children shown to absorb unsafe levels of CO2 when masked, and yet all of these schools, including local schools, insisting that children wear masks while in school. Our guest today, Dr. Ben Braddock, has researched COVID, the shots, and the treatments. What he has to say is important and should be shared far and wide while you still can. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with Dr. Ben Braddock in just a moment.
Join the revolution. Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Shilling Show Unleashed.
The Shilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Dr. Ben Braddock, someone who's been putting a lot of time into studying COVID truths and lies, and that's the topic of today's interview. Dr. Ben Braddock, thank you for joining us today on the Shilling Show Unleashed.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start out on the origins of COVID. There's been a lot of discussion. I think many people knew where this came from a long time ago, and yet this is a revelation to the media. What's been going on here?
There has been a lot going on in the past month or two, but not a lot of new information being uncovered. Me and associates of mine have been censored by the media going back. It's fairly obvious that this was a lab experiment, either tragically gone wrong or potentially deliberately released. It was kind of hard to tell which one of those two it was, but the natural origin stuff just doesn't check out very well. You know, now you see a lot in the mainstream media to where they're finally coming around and kind of discussing this. But when they do so, they're really putting it off on the Chinese almost exclusively. You know, while I think they deserve their fair share of the criticism, really it was mostly just a Chinese lab, but it was American funds that went into that, and American scientists who were involved. Peter Daszak, the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, and Ralph Baric out of UNC in North Carolina. They were both driving a lot of this research into collecting new bat viruses out of caves in southern China, actually quite some distance from Wuhan, which is why the natural origin just didn't make a lot of sense. Also, taking those viruses, splicing them with other viruses. They created chimeras with where you would essentially splice together. One of them was they spliced together HIV, hepatitis B, the original SARS, and then I believe some proteins from a new bat virus strain that they had discovered. So this is the real crux of the thing. It wasn't just what was going on with kind of standard Chinese virology research. It was this group was driving some gain of function research to essentially make the virus more pathogenic, where it would escape people's immune systems. And they do this under the guise of saying that they want to see where the next pandemic might come from. So they lab experiments to see what kind of mutations might occur. The way they conduct these experiments, you get mutations of viruses that would really never occur naturally. They only occur as a result of gene editing and a lot of manipulation. And so the question at this point is, was this a accidental release, or was it potentially deliberate? Because it does, if you look at this system of control that's been erected and, how they've really taken advantage of the situation. They were either very quick to respond, make the best of the situation, or, there might have been some sort of planned release. It's kind of hard to tell from that, but I think that's what needs to be looked into in the investigation, because they talk about lab leak all the time, as if it's just a given that this was totally an accident. Now, I kind of lean towards an accident being most likely. And I think that one of the reasons why they locked down so hard early on and pushed that, because it's usually very contrary to how you handle these things, is that they did understand that it came out of the lab. And so really early on, they didn't know what exactly they were dealing with.
Dr. Ben Braddock, what is the association of Dr. Fauci, the revered Dr. Fauci, to this lab and to this research?
Dr. Fauci is sort of the Robert Moses of the scientific community, the guy who built pretty much all of New York's parks infrastructure and all that he ruled over that system for 30, 40 years, and was, before Fauci, was probably the most powerful man in America who had never faced an election. That's kind of Fauci's role. He's been running the show since the AIDS crisis. He is, if you're a researcher in the United States, or even at a lot of our, partner organizations in Canada, Europe, these places, your funding is ultimately comes from Fauci somehow. His fingerprints are everywhere. So he decides what research gets done, what doesn't. These experiments that were being conducted in Wuhan, they were, ultimately being paid for by you and me as taxpayers. But, that money is controlled by Dr. Fauci. And of course it gets, kind of laundered through the grant process, right? So they'll give, so many million to EcoHealth Alliance for, some kind of general research purposes. And then EcoHealth Alliance will, either directly fund one of the programs at Wuhan, or they'll even get another organization, right? So like EcoHealth Alliance might hire some university, and then the university will end up paying. But with some of their more controversial research projects, sometimes you get 2 or 3 layers, so it doesn't show up directly in the NIAID grant system. But if you keep following the money, the connections become fairly clear. And they didn't hide that thoroughly with what was going on here. And some of the reporters over at National File, they've done a great job of compiling this stuff and documenting it. It's up on their website. Yeah, there's significant funding outlays to this sort of research.
How did this man, Dr. Fauci, amass such power?
I think the answer to that is in one of the emails that came about on the Hillary Clinton WikiLeaks dump. There's an email on there from after she testified at the Benghazi hearing. It's from Dr. Fauci to her chief of staff. And it was talking about how great she looked, how healthy she looked, and just what a wonderful job she did. And then it ended with, please tell her we love her, which is a strange thing for, one government bureaucrat to be saying to another, I love you, right? Mm-hmm. It does show how he's been able to ingratiate himself with the ruling class, because this kind of thing, I think to normal people, this kind of sycophantic laying it on thick, this would be repulsive to a normal person. But politicians, by and large, they love it. They have a completely different personality type. They're mostly egomaniacs. This puts them in a symbiotic relationship with them, and it makes sure, he's very smart politically, because you would see, even when you could tell there were the disagreements with Trump, he would still not air things out directly. He wouldn't even complain about him in a private email. I mean, the guy hates Trump, but he was still very careful in how he approached any sort of criticism. I think you do that for long enough. He was also good at working behind the scenes to squelch any criticism. And this went back into the 80s, when they were still figuring out the origins of AIDS. Anyone who had any contrary opinion, and it didn't matter, they could be Nobel Prize winners, just people with impeccable credentials. Fauci would go, work his behind-the-scenes network, get interviews pulled. These guys just got completely shut out of the media ecosystem. So he's very good at working his media contacts, and that's what the FOIA emails from this latest batch kind of show. He spent very little time. You go through this email trail. He spent very little time, discussing the virus itself. And you would go page after page of him going sort of back and forth with reporters, getting interviews set up. Or, you had one, I believe it was a Atlantic reporter who was upset that he didn't have time for an interview with her, but he had one with New York Times that came out the same weekend. So he's going back and forth, 4 or 5 emails trying to, smooth out this relationship. So it's the thing. He focuses a lot of energy on his relationship with politicians and with people in the media. And I think you saw kind of how that paid off. I mean, he had glowing press coverage throughout this entire event. I think a lot of it is politicians and press where, a lot of people are midwits. They defer to him as being, some sort of expert. The man hasn't practiced medicine since the 1960s. He has no idea what COVID actually does in a clinical setting. You have guys like Paul Merrick from Eastern Virginia Med School, who would say that, by the third or fourth COVID patient, they already knew that they were dealing with a hyperactive immune response and blood clotting. The federal government, as the standard of care guidelines, they still have implemented a recommendation to take blood thinners. And that's intervention, something as simple as aspirin, could have cut the death rate possibly a third or so. I mean, you just see it's sociopathic what they've recommended for treatment, which is supportive care. And that's essentially telling people to take Tylenol, drink water, right? They say this is a virus. There's not really much you can do to treat a viral infection. So you do the supportive care until you get to the point of needing to be put on a ventilator, or you have a blood clot and a horrible stroke or heart attack or something as a result of that, and then there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, it was almost like it was set up to kill as many people as possible. People who are actually dealing with this hands-on tell you, if you recognize the signs, it's not the viral infection that's really causing the problems, it's your immune response to it. You have this massive immune response that ends up creating a ton of inflammation in your lungs and other places. And then you also have these weird effects of the virus on the blood. And this is the thing, they keep calling it a respiratory virus, like it's the flu or something. I would categorize it more as a vascular disease. When you have the virus in the bloodstream, it causes your platelets to start clotting together. It causes your iron metabolism to go through the roof. I mean, your iron levels are 5, 6, 7 times what they would normally be. Those high iron levels, they create a situation where they react with unsaturated fat, LDL cholesterol in your bloodstream, and start creating a lot of oxidative damage. And it also drives the release of a lot of serotonin. It causes the serotonin in your bloodstream to degranulate, and that starts kind of poisoning your system through serotonin syndrome-like shock. We have treatments for all of these things, right? We have systemic steroids, we have blood thinners, and we have antivirals. We have ivermectin binds to the viral proteins, works very well. And even hydroxychloroquine, there was so much, time and debate over that, and it seemed like they landed on it doesn't work. And then finally we've gotten to the point where they're now saying in some of the larger studies, well, actually it does work. You have to take it early enough. And actually, if you take it in combination with this other drug called bromhexine, which is a over-the-counter mucolytic, it's near 100% effective when taken early enough because it blocks both sites. Hydroxychloroquine didn't come out of nowhere. It was the treatment of choice for the original SARS. And so people who, remembered the first SARS outbreak, they remembered, hey, chloroquine works on this. Why don't we try this? That's where that came from. The way SARS-2 is, I think, engineered, it has an additional site that it can use to enter your cells. That site is not bound by hydroxychloroquine like the original site. It'll bind about half of the potential pathways into your cells. But if you take bromhexine, it binds the other site, so you get kind of a full spectrum protection. But there's a lot of different things you can do to improve outcome. Even simple stuff, vitamin D, zinc, this kind of thing. And none of these got put on the standard of care. That is a huge scandal in and of itself. And see, they're still suppressing a lot of these treatments, like ivermectin, which has worked beautifully in other countries. If you look at India's case count after ivermectin was recommended by their national and state governments at the end of April, their COVID cases have fallen off a cliff. New Delhi's down 99%, Goa's down 90%. These big states, you see these declines that we haven't seen really in a natural decline in any other situation. Like after our spike in the winter, ours just kind of gradually resolved itself. This is just like, it's just COVID's getting crushed. Mexico City has a policy where they hand out ivermectin at the testing sites. If you come to get tested, they tell you take the ivermectin anyway. In Argentina, Egypt, been studies there where they've given ivermectin to healthcare workers and to people who live in the house, family members of COVID patients. The transmission rate's nearly zero if you take ivermectin as a preventative. My suspicion as to why they don't want, word of ivermectin getting out here, and why, you can very quickly lose your Facebook or Twitter account if you talk about it, right? Brett Weinstein, he's been interviewing some doctors on this recently, and his YouTube videos have been getting pulled down. And he had a video with the inventor of the mRNA vaccine, where he was talking about the damage that the spike protein in the vaccine can do to your cells. It's highly toxic to your cells, and it doesn't just stay in one area in your body. It can get to your heart, and I think that's why we're seeing these myocarditis cases. Can cross the blood-brain barrier, cause neurological issues, all of this. He was discussing these issues. They take it down. Anything that's contradictory to the government's goal of getting a shot in every arm, this kind of stuff gets suppressed. And I think the reason for it is these vaccines are operating under a emergency use authorization. And the legal requirement for emergency use authorization is that there can be no other therapy that's safe and effective, right? So if it were recognized that, we could treat this stuff even preventatively with ivermectin, then suddenly the legal justification for, enrolling the public in what's still a phase 3 trial, that disappears. It's still in the trial phases, and we're doing this massive experiment on the entire population. It's not even being conducted as a proper medical study, because in a good medical study, you're collecting all the information on adverse events. You go in for, medical trial, they're trying out a new blood pressure drug or whatever else. They want to know as much information about, anything that happens to you physically as possible while you're on this trial. Right now, we have a system called VAERS for reporting adverse events. It's not many doctors that are even writing these things up to submit to VAERS, but even if you do, getting it uploaded is an issue. I've talked to doctors and nurses who are like, we've had adverse events, and we try to report them, but the reporting system is just not working. And the results and what is being posted, we've seen a huge spike in deaths and adverse events. We haven't seen anything like this in the history of VAERS. We haven't seen it for any other kind of vaccination. It looks like this huge jump, and then you start talking to people who, would be submitting these reports, and you find out that very few are getting any through. And, then the realization hits that, as dramatic as this looks, VAERS is only capturing a small fraction of what's actually going on out there.
We're talking with Dr. Ben Braddock, COVID Truths and Lies. Let's talk about the risks for kids and young people. I have neighbors here who are in a rush to get their kids vaccinated. They can't wait. And yet we're hearing little nibbles in the news media about problems with kids and young people in these vaccines.
You have a few risk factors that go in here. One is that, vaccines become, these in particular, they become quite a bit more dangerous if you have ever had COVID before, because your immune system already recognizes it. So you get the vaccine and your immune system recognizes a spike protein and begins to mount a massive immune response. The mRNA, the messengers, are telling your cells to produce the spike protein. And they will keep producing this spike protein until the cells just naturally die out. And for the muscle cells that they're injecting this to in your arm, that's about 30 days. When you have COVID, a natural infection, you're talking 2 to 5 days of actually having a detectable amount of virus in the body for most people. And young people tend to the shorter side of that, right? And so a lot of them have had COVID already without even showing symptoms. They're getting this, very strong immune reaction shortly after the shot, like you would see in someone who had kind of recently had COVID. Because they're young, their immune systems tend to be healthier, and a healthy immune system mounts a much stronger response. We're giving everyone the same dosage, right? So an 80-year-old nursing home patient is getting the exact same amount as a 16-year-old. And so they created these vaccines to get a strong enough response in the older people. So for a younger person, this amounts to just an insane overdose. Even setting aside all the other problems, the idea that you would need to give 2 shots to a young person instead of just one of the 2-shot series, that right there is really crazy. But the other is that, because young people just aren't susceptible to the virus, and there is a adverse event profile, you have to, and this is using Pfizer's own data, you kill 5 young people for every life you save. I think the CDC's current estimate is they think that the myocarditis, so heart inflammation, they think it's happening at a frequency of around 1 in 10,000, bad enough for someone to basically have a heart attack. I mean, and we are seeing this. We're seeing 20-year-olds having heart attacks. I mean, there was a case the other day. This was kind of on Twitter. A family member posted it and it went viral, but a 13-year-old boy died of it, went into cardiac failure. If you're talking 1 in 10,000 are having a severe cardiac event, Pfizer estimates that you have to vaccinate 500,000 teenagers to save one life. So we're talking about 50 severe heart injuries at a minimum for every life saved. And, we don't know yet, if these cardiac events are going to resolve, right? You see a 22-year-old with 13% heart function, and it's been that way for a month. You kind of wonder, is this going to improve significantly, or are they going to be left for the rest of their lives with this damage? Because I've seen people, they've had adverse reactions, say in early March. You still have them, you still see them on supplemental oxygen because they can't walk across a room without getting out of breath because their bodies reacted. And we've seen reactions where people's lungs have become damaged, and it's questionable if they'll ever actually recover from it. So when you're talking about adverse effects in young people, you can be talking about a lifelong disability, even if they survive whatever the initial problem is. The fact that that the CDC is pushing this. I mean, they're having Xbox giveaways, for goodness sake. It's Nuremberg trial level insanity. I mean, it's such a breach of medical ethics that unimaginable to me, actually. You have this other situation where they're doing these trials on babies as young as 6 months old. And there's you can't consent to that, right? I mean, we recognize that, you can't consent to a lot of other things until you're 18, but you're having something injected into your body that could cause permanent damage. That just, to me, that just seems criminal. And, it would be one thing if this posed much of a threat to younger people, but every person below around, so I'd say about 22, I've seen who's had COVID. For them, it's been less severe than a bout of the seasonal flu. That's a good thing. We should be very happy that this virus does not pose a major threat to children and teenagers. But then to say that, they need to be vaccinated and, take on that risk, it's what is it all for? And it seems like it's just, the government has this fixation on getting their numbers up. There's this obsession with getting to 100% vaccination rates without really thinking is it appropriate to vaccinate the entire population? The entire population is not vulnerable. Why would you not just go for your populations that are really at risk? Right, because when you're talking to someone who's 80 years old in a nursing home, then the potential adverse effects that might balance out because that fit the profile of someone who is going to have a very hard time with COVID. To do it outside of that, I mean, I've gotten to the point where I'm iffy on all of them at all, because even your vulnerable people, they respond very well to these treatments that I mentioned before, things like ivermectin. So why would you risk giving a 7-year-old having a stroke? Because these spike proteins, they're really not vaccines. They're gene therapies. They don't work anything like a traditional vaccine. But these spike proteins, they get into your vascular system. It causes inflammation within your blood vessels, and that leads to blood clots. And so that means you have pulmonary embolisms, you have heart attacks, you have strokes. A lot of people dismiss this when they see these kind of events happening in seniors. They dismiss it as, well, they had chronic health conditions anyway, so it wasn't really the vaccine that killed them. I was like, well, where was that logic a year ago? Right? When you had someone, I talked to nurses who they're telling me about people who were dying of heroin overdoses, but because on the PCR test, they tested positive for COVID, they were coded as COVID, and there was a higher reimbursement for the hospitals if it was a COVID death. So it was you had a lot of corruption early on in how these numbers were being reported. Yeah, we've got just two completely different logical standards. When it comes to a natural infection, we treat it like, the virus is responsible for 100% of the deaths, instead of maybe just being a tipping point, or, someone had a car accident while they happened to be positive for COVID. And then in the cases of someone who's had who's died after vaccination, oh, that's totally coincidental, right? You can't implicate it at all. So we've been spun into a very unreal world.
It's really remarkable what's been going on, and you've done an excellent job in covering this. Dr. Ben Braddock, I want people to follow you online so they can read your work as it comes out. Would you tell us where they can do that?
You can do it at GraduatedBen on Twitter, or benjaminbraddock.substack.com. I have a newsletter there that's sort of a backup. I got put in Twitter jail recently for ivermectin, so that's probably my most secure.
Well, Dr. Ben Braddock, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. We appreciate your work, and you're taking the time with our audience.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.